Welcome to The Other Side of Change, only on the Black Star Network. Assata Shakur talks about being weapons of mass construction, something that's only possible when we plan for a world where we actually win. And that's exactly what we do here at The Other Side of Change. This show moves beyond the world as it is to where it could and should be. I'm Brea Baker, here with my brilliant co-host, Jamira Burley, and we're just two millennial women tackling everything at the intersection of politics, gender, and pop culture.
We don't settle for commentary. This space is for solution-driven dialogue and reimagining. We hope to activate the next generation of change makers existing in the unbalanced world where profit conflicts with what is best in the best interest of the community.
And later on today, we're going to talk about that in the context of environmental disasters and systemic exploitation, how these disasters are turned into profit opportunities at the expense of the most vulnerable.
That's right, Brea. From the wildfires in California to the unexpected snowstorms in the South, extreme weathers is becoming the norm. But what is even more alarming is how quickly some of those people move to take advantage of those tragedies.
Yeah, 1,000,000%. That's the American way, right? Like taking advantage of
how much people like get out of people constantly. It's really obnoxious.
Yeah, very much so. Well, let's start with the news because there's been a lot of obnoxious news. What's the craziest headline you've seen this week?
I mean, the craziest headline is we've all probably seen information go around regarding the ICE raids. And for those who don't know what ICE means, it's the Immigration and Custom Enforcement. They are, the police of the government to round up folks who are here undocumented. And we've seen raids happen all over the country due to the direction of the president, Donald Trump. And now he's challenging birthright citizenship, which is beyond crazy to me, but not unexpected.
Yeah. And that's the crazy part, because what you talked about is like ICE is designed to round up undocumented people, which is its own messed up thing anyway. But these recent raids have also been attacking Native Americans. So it's like, how are you making anyone who is indigenous to this country prove their citizenship? But also birthright citizenship affects Black people. That's actually where it was designed, was the 14th Amendment after the Civil War to give Black people citizenship because we were previously property. So it's just dangerous precedent that's coming with this.
I mean, it's also a recognition that America would not be where it is today without immigration, without the diversity of folks from all over the world who come to this country with the idea that they want better for their families. But also a lot of immigrants who come to this country come here because we have decimated their communities elsewhere. And I think that's a reality that people refuse to address. And so whether the reality that we stole this land from the indigenous populations of the Native Americans who were here first, or we forced enslaved folks to build this country, and now we're trying to question their citizenship. It's a prime example that this is an administration of white supremacists who only want a country that looks like them, regardless of those who made this country what it is, which we know are the indigenous and the immigrant population that have come here, as well as the enslaved population. But yes, it definitely impacts Black people. So for Black folks who are like, this is not our issue,
girl, I've been tussling on Facebook all week about it. I have been so shocked that people I grew up with, I grew up in New York. It's a community that is mostly Black and brown. And even the Black folks are immigrants from the Caribbean, from West Africa, from lots of different places. So it's just been wild to get on Beyonce's internet and see Black people, and particularly Black women. Like I've really been a comment section warrior lately because I've just been so alarmed at it. And also, like what you brought up is they're not in defense of all citizens and saying we're going to protect all citizens from the dangers. Like that's just the excuse they're using to get support. But in reality, Elon Musk is he came over illegally, and he
also violated his visa.
Yes,
by here and working during his student visa. So,
and he was an immigrant in South Africa too. Let's keep it real.
No,
Melania.
That's the scary part about it all, is that people are assuming that this is about the rule of law, and it's not. It is about rounding as many people who do not look white in this country up and letting people get mixed up in the shuffle. And I mean, there was just a Jamaican American who was just arrested. There was a Native American. There was an indigenous member of the Navajo Nation who was arrested by ICE. There are people who just speak a different language, Spanish, or who are being targeted by ICE. This is not about the rule of law. This is about being very much a racist policy that is trying to round up people of color.
1,000,000%. Because if it was about dangerous people, we'd be starting with the white supremacists, the Dylan.
We'll be starting with the administration, girl.
Right. We'd be starting with them. So it's just alarming. Like, oh, great. You're trying to keep us safe and you're going to elementary schools to do it, like in Chicago and Georgia. And my father-in-law is a principal. So it's just definitely alarming. And people are really learning, like, we have to be very vigilant.
And also if we're saying that these folks are coming over here to freeload, then the question is, why are ICE going to workplaces, right? Why are they going to schools, right? These are people who are contributing to our economy. They're contributing to the culture of our society. And I think we can't minimize the impact that they've made, but also how good this policy is in the long run.
1,000,000%. And speaking of freeloaders, the actual freeloaders are the damn U.S. military and Pentagon, because the other insane headline from this week is that there was this plane crash with an American Airlines commercial jet and then a Black Hawk, which, how much are Black Hawks? This is a military air, right?
Yeah, I saw that a Black Hawk could cost anywhere between $5.9 million to build. That doesn't mean that's the operational cost to actually continue it. Right. So in addition to the loss of life from the commercial jet and those who were on the Black Hawk, we're also talking about just money that has been thrown down the toilet, basically, because of the incompetence of the U.S. government.
Right. And Trump has been trying to say that the crash was that DE&I is to blame, which it's like mind blowing that they just pulled out DE&I as a boogeyman. But he fired the head of the TSA. He fired the Aviation Security Advisory Committee, and he froze hiring of air traffic controllers, all within his first 48 hours in office. And now is surprised that people are confused on what's going on over there. Like, why was a military plane or helicopter doing a training near Reagan Airport? Like, that doesn't make sense.
And we don't have incidents like this. Like, this is not occurring every other day. I think there has not been a crash of a commercial flight on the U.S. soil since 2009. So this is very unusual. And for this to happen a week and a half into the new administration after, to your point, he made all of these extreme cuts and preventing a very prominent institution from doing its job, especially in our nation capital, I think is extremely dangerous. But it just goes to show you that this is an administration that is chaos and confusion.
Very unserious, extremely unserious.
They're serious. They're just also racist and stupid. So there's that. Right?
That part. Sure. Well, speaking of stupid and racist and all of the things, I mean, we've also seen that really play out with a lot of these weather-related madness that's going on, right?
Ooh, I mean, what a week. I think if we look at the weather-related madness, as you mentioned, we'll start really questioning what is happening with our environment, especially with the lack of direction that is coming from the administration all the way down to the state level.
1,000,000%. I'm here in Georgia. We've had 2 snowfalls already in this year, and I've lived here for 5 years, and this is the most snow I've seen my entire time being here. It left thousands without power, cars stranded, highways just completely unusable. And then meanwhile, on the other side of the country, on your coast, we've got California still reeling from those devastating wildfires. And like, it consumed media attention for a bit, and then people sort of forgot those fires were just contained. And that's even scary. And when they were contained, it was just in time for this huge rainfall that was threatening like floods and mudslides. So it's just been feeling very apocalyptic.
Yeah, and it's the same story every single time. Like, too often we look at these incidents in very isolated moments, right? The wildfires or the snowstorms that are happening in Atlanta. I didn't even know Atlanta could get snow. So seeing some of the images reminded me of like the 90s in Philadelphia when we had these huge snowstorms. So the idea that the South is now experiencing these extreme weather threats, I think is really, really devastating, because all of the families that are losing right now, right, because of the lack of government assistance and the lack of government direction that is preventing them from being able to properly prepare for these type of devastations.
Yeah, 1,000,000%. Even what you just talked about, because again, growing up in New York, I'm used to big snowstorms, like 2+ feet. Atlanta got like 3 inches both times, but it's the lack of infrastructure. There's no there's no support for actually getting out there, clearing those roads, making sure that people can get around safely. But then you're still mandating that they're coming into work. They're keeping people from working from home. There's no public transportation investment here, which is also by design. So it's very alarming. And I feel like that's what we're going to unpack today, is how these disasters expose those systemic inequalities and lead to what's known as disaster capitalism. And I mean, I don't love to give a white woman credit for coining something, but I do think that Naomi Klein did coin the term disaster capitalism in her book, The Shock Doctrine. And so we're going to get into that. And this segment is where we're going to pick apart the headlines, though. What are they getting right? Where are the gaps in news coverage? And Jamira, you and I can offer these headlines. Yeah, mostly what they're getting wrong. What they should be, right? Like, let's remix some of this and be like, yeah, revise, cross that out, white out, all of that.
Yeah, that's so true. I think the one that really stuck out to me is there's one headline that came up in CBS News that said, for many who lost homes in Los Angeles fires, insurance won't cover entire costs of rebuilding. The reality is those insurance companies have been taking premiums from those families for decades, right? Mm-hmm. Requiring them to have insurance. And now all of a sudden they are picking up, closing up their wallets and leaving the state without any repercussions. And so that for me just goes to show you that this is a prime example of like, just, the transfer of wealth and in the lack of government accountability for those insurance companies who were required to operate and now all of a sudden are not, fulfilling their end of the bargain. Like, I want my money. I would want my money back if I've been paying into these premiums for years, only to be told that actually you're not getting anything. Or you're not.
It's my money and I need it now. Like, for real. That's exactly where I'm at. I think it's just also, as you said,
yourself from
I'm aging myself. JG. But actually, though, it's like insane for you to collect the money and then be like, what money? You rebuild, huh? Like, sorry, I'm somewhere on vacation. It's also been alarming because there's a death toll. And I think there's been a lot of attention on property destruction, rightfully so, because people are losing everything. But there is a death toll that has risen to 29. That's dozens of people who have lost their lives in these fires, let alone all the people who have lost their primary homes. And yet Page Six ran a piece that said all the celebrities impacted by the Los Angeles fires. And it goes down the list, naming people like Paris Hilton and Bella Hadid. And again, I'm not going to say that anyone, who loses their home isn't feeling grief around that. Mm-hmm. But I mean, there are some people losing one of their homes, and there are some people who are losing a home that is housed multiple generations of Black and brown people. And we're just centering white celebrities when there are people who are not going to be able to bounce back, who are not going to have some big project next year that's going to make it all up in one sweep. Like, there's real loss here. Like, a Black Air Force vet was just running for his life towards what? Who knows? But like, where are those stories? Why are we so focused on A-listers?
Yeah. And it's also it's pretty heartbreaking because a lot of those, we know that one of the ways to build wealth in this country is through home ownership. And we know a lot of folks who lost their homes, particularly in those Black and brown communities, have had those homes in their families for generations. Yeah. This might be the only plot of land that they had to their name. And to watch them lose their homes and the lack of coverage of that, but then more importantly, seeing all those folks who are trying to come in and sweep in and buy those homes for pennies on the dollar, it sucks, right? Because now not only are you out of your home, you can't even go to work. Right. What is your children's schools may be non-existent. Right. You're trying to pick up the pieces and you lost all of the memories, the pictures, the photos. Yeah. When I was younger, we had a house fire and I don't even have that many baby pictures anymore because of all we lost. So I can imagine so many folks who have nothing else, have nothing to call their own. And all they see on the media is celebrities who, to your point, are maybe this is their second, third vacation home, and they'll be able to rebuild overnight, right? They're not going to be the ones truly impacted. Right. It reminds me of another article that came out regarding the president's visit.
Oh, girl.
The president's visit to, I don't, your president, y'all president.
Y'all, come on.
Not my president. He visited parts of LA. So LA Times ran a story talking about how the president Donald Trump toured this Pacific Palisade fire devastation, but did not go to the predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods intentionally further marginalizing those communities, and not drawing awareness to the fact that they were lacking the resources and tools to be able to rebuild. So. Yeah,
that was really, I mean, I saw a video of Attorney Ben Crump hosting a town hall, and there were just Black elders just sobbing and crying, like, we are waiting for relief. Who's coming for us? And I've seen an outpouring through like GoFundMe's and things of that nature, but we shouldn't have to crowdsource when this federal government, to collecting our premiums. You collect our taxes every year swiftly, okay?
And if you don't, we would get arrested.
With haste. Yeah. And then when it's time to do something, it's like, sorry, I can't go everywhere. I can only visit the rich people, which is really frustrating. So yeah, that headline definitely needs to be shifted. It's not that Altadena residents feel forgotten. They were forgotten. They were invisibilized. They were ignored. And you brought up all of the systemic racism that a lot of these Black elders had to survive to even get those homes, the redlining they had to survive, the employment discrimination they had to survive, all to buy these homes that are their version of the American dream, and to have it literally burned to ashes before their eyes, and then have to turn around and beg the president to even stop by, even pay attention.
To see that they exist. Yeah.
It's sick. It's really sad. And then lastly, I know everyone was praying for rain, and we got to get some water in here, which was needed to help contain the fires, because the firefighters were working nonstop, 30% of them being incarcerated firefighters. But then it was wild, because then the rain came and it was like flooding and mudslides. And so it's just very alarming what is happening in California, and that the climate scientists and the climate activists have been sounding the alarm that this is a state that is really in need of deep rehabilitation. Like it's dry, but also cannot handle water. And it's scary. This is scary times.
It is scary, and we're gonna hold on to that thought and take a quick break. So the other side of change will be back after this break, only on the Black Star Network.
Hello, I'm Isaac Hayes III, founder and CEO of Fanbase. And right now we're accepting investors in our $17 million round to revolutionize the future of social media. Today, for just $399, you can own 60 shares of stock in Fanbase at $665 a share. Go to startengine.com/fanbase and invest today. While the big platforms have grown too massive and disconnected from their users, Fanbase is building a platform where creators and users truly come first. We've already raised $8.6 million from everyday investors who believe in this vision, and now you can join them. This is your chance to invest in a social media tech company with over 1 million users that is disrupting media by allowing anyone to reach all of their following and monetize their content from day one. The market is changing, big platforms are failing to serve their users, and Fanbase is stepping up to fill the gap. Don't wait until it's too late. Invest now. Invest for yourself and your future. Go to startengine.com/fanbase and own the future of social media.
On the other side of change, only on the Black Star Network. You know, before we took a break, we were discussing the LA fires, but also the the climate that is happening all across the country, the extreme weather that we're seeing both on the West Coast where I'm at, but also on in the southern side of the state and southern side of the country where Brea is. And I want to talk about disaster capitalism, which you brought up earlier in the show. You know, disaster capitalism thrives on crises. Landlords will hike up the prices, corporations will buy out and burn down communities, and longtime residents are now displaced, right? They have nowhere to go to be able to rebuild, to recuperate what they lost, or even to find a safe place for their families to sleep. Many of these folks are either sleeping on their loved ones' couches, are finding brief rentals. Some of them are sleeping outside or in their cars. So it is extremely, extremely dangerous times. And one stark example of this is the hands-off, I don't know why. Altadena movement that is happening in California, where families are fighting back about these predatory investors that are coming in, trying to swoop in and take up their properties. What are you hearing from folks?
Yeah, I mean, disaster is big business, unfortunately for us. But yeah, I have a few friends who, you know, my good friend Kimberly Bolton, her family has lost 6 homes in that area because she has a lot of aunts, uncles, parents who are all living in the same community who have done that for safety, who is saying, let's build community with one another, live close to one another. And now we had to all watch our houses burn with one another. And it's really scary. It's heartbreaking, but it's also inspiring because these communities are resisting, they're resilient. It's a reminder that resilience is not just about the rebuild, but about making sure that people know Altadena is ours. You can't take what is rightfully ours. And that has been beautiful. Another person is Brea Baker, who is the creator behind Smarter in Seconds. And she is also a beautiful author. Her family lost some homes there as well. And so they have multiple generations, nieces, nephews, uncles, grandparents, all staying in the same home as they wait for a rebuild, which who knows how long something like that actually takes.
It takes years. I mean, if anyone has ever seen anything built anywhere, right, you have to go through all of these governmental red tapes. You have to, one, be able to hire the staff to be able to do this. And when you have this much devastation, to your point, we don't know how long it's going to take. I also think it's really important to note that many of the folks, particularly in those Black and brown communities that lost homes, these are people, consider even Blair Imani, these are people who are providing services and resources to other people. Like many of them lead organizations and nonprofits that do services to those communities. So those nonprofits and organizations are also feeling the impact of that. And this is not just about housing, right? This sits at the intersection of race, class, climate justice. What happens when rebuilding efforts excludes those people's, those stories and those communities from being able to fully be able to thrive again, especially as they're dealing with like these predatory investors that are like whispering in their ear, telling them, hey, you know, if an insurance company leaves your state, maybe you should sell. What? Like, that's not how they should have never been allowed to leave in the first place.
1,000,000%. And I think the scariest thing is like, if that's how bad it is for people who are homeowners who own the land that the house sat on, then imagine for those who are renters who don't own any of their housing, who are at the mercy of the rebuild of the developers and the management buildings who own their spaces, or even for people who depend on these spaces for employment. Like, what happens to farm workers who are picking and growing our food, and we're doing so with masks on because the smoke is still in the air. I mean, they've been giving out these warnings around what the air quality is going to look like for the next several months, because you're not just, I mean, we think about it. It's like, yes, people's houses are burning, which means plastic is burning, steel is burning, brick is burning, wood is burning, trash is burning, chemicals are burning, cars were burning. To have to breathe that in, it's scary to understand, like, okay, even after people rebuild their homes and have their schools and community spaces rebuilt, their health is going to be affected for much longer than probably is going to be tracked. And I remember this as a New Yorker after 9/11. I mean, people were not breathing right. And there were later suits around the air quality and improper warning for people about like how they should be protecting themselves in a state and in a city that just was banning masking.
Literally, I mean, well, in a country that's banning masking, right? Yeah. As if all of these diseases and viruses have now evaporated into the thin air. But to your point with not, like, we also have to think about like Katrina, right? This country continues to never learn its lesson. It never thinks about infrastructure. And it's so frustrating seeing how much money is just being wasted in our federal government, how much money is being sent outside of the United States to do harm elsewhere. But yet we lack the desire and the political will to be able to strengthen our infrastructure for the very citizens who put money into into the coffers of the American dollar. I mean, into the government bank, right?
Yeah, no, 1,000,000%. I'm glad that you brought up Katrina. This moment feels very reminiscent because even in Katrina, like it was that, yes, you have this flooding. And that's the thing about disaster capitalism, because people are sort of like, why are you bringing up race? Why are you bringing up, it's not political. We're all in this together. And it's like, no, the natural disaster comes, and that the natural disaster itself is not racist. It's the response that our government does or does not give that is racist, that is very discriminatory. So in Katrina, it was like, let's break the levees and sacrifice Black residents and their communities and their homes, have them be climate refugees in stadiums while white residents are being flown out as long as you can afford to, right? And like, I think that's what we're seeing here is that when they were evacuating folks, it was at the mercy of you being able to fly out and have somewhere to go. There was no real coordinated response of here is where you go. And we have planes ready to fly people out to safer spaces. And it shouldn't be this way. Like, why are we always the first ones to be deemed collateral damage and the last ones to be protected?
Yeah, I'm trying to stop myself from crying because I just remember the images from Katrina of people like standing on their roofs and on top of cars and like waving signs, and they went days without fresh water, like days in a country that literally has sent people to the moon, right? Like we can't get water and food to folks who are suffering. Reminds me of Kanye West saying, you know, George Bush doesn't like Black people.
That was some of his best work.
The United States government doesn't like Black people.
No, truly. We need that Kanye back because we need truth tellers right now. We need people to say it. And I feel like what's frustrating, I miss the old Kanye straight up. But no, actually, and what's scary is like we have 1 million documentaries and books and exposés and investigative articles explaining just how much the government failed Black people during Hurricane Katrina. We're what, like nearly 20 years out from that. And now we're still facing situations where the same thing is happening. And it's like, at what point do we learn? At what point does it not become entertainment that someone gets to profit off of? It's not a Netflix documentary, but at what point are government officials actually learning how to better protect us?
Yeah. Especially, I mean, let's not forget California, it be eating up the paycheck. Okay. They take those taxes out. Like we pay for that infrastructure, and a lot of things can be true at once, right? Like a lot of things can be true at once. But what we do know is that the devastation also always impacts Black people vastly different, or Black and brown communities vastly different than it does our white counterparts. You mentioned books. I just finished right before the LA fires. If anyone has ever heard of Octavia Butler, phenomenal writer. And for years, I was afraid to read Parable of the Sower. I heard so many stories about it. And to be honest, since COVID, I haven't been able to, what I think is like trauma porn. I'm not saying that about this book, but a lot of like books where the reality is just too hard. I can't consume it. But I read it right before the fires, and I can't tell you how eerie it is to read that book, especially because, Octavia says she's not predicting the future. She is looking at the patterns of the past and making conclusions about what we know to be true. Yeah. Just talked about Katrina, patterns of the past and the lack of government infrastructure or the lack of political will to give a damn about these communities.
Right.
The stage for it to happen again.
Yeah, that's the part. I really appreciate her saying that. Like, I'm not actually predicting the future. I'm just putting our current problems 30 years into the future and saying, what happens if we let them persist? And so the challenge is like, I mean, if y'all were reading the book back then, we could have avoided some of this stuff. Like, I read the book, I read the book last year because the book begins in July 2024. And I was like, you know what? Let me read it on timeline. And it was so eerie and strange to be like, why is so much of this so spot on? Down to there being a president running for office talking about making America great again. And she's bringing that up because that's what Reagan was saying. So it's like we've allowed that to shapeshift and transform and evolve into Donald Trump when we could have nipped it in the bud and cut it at the knees back then. And so it's just frustrating to realize, like, in an ideal world, Octavia Butler would be considered outdated work. Like, oh, that was before Al Gore. That was before we were serious about climate. But we didn't. We got Bush and everything else that comes after that. And it's like, this is what happens when you let the problem persist. So it's
America's a masochist, as far as I'm concerned. We like the pain to the extent that we want to experience it over and over and over and over again, and then look up and be like, well, how did this happen?
Yeah,
it happened. Actually, we let it happen. But hopefully this time is different. I mean, we're seeing communities pull themselves together much faster than our government is acting, and I think that is giving me hope, especially at a time where it feels like so much of our country is divided across political lines because of just the hate that is running rampant. Right? Yeah. Like if we're honest with ourselves, at the core of the decisions and the political decisions that people are making is rooted in hate. It's rooted in discrimination. It's rooted in racism, and it's playing out across a multitude of ways, including how our government responds to the climate, climate impact. But one thing about climate is that it's eventually going to impact all of us, right? It's no color. It sees no social economic class. You might be able to respond differently after it happens, but when that storm hits, when the fire starts, we're all at the mercy of its natural direction. So
all of us. And so hopefully we learn the lesson that Octavia was trying to teach us, which is that community is the only antidote. We have to keep one another safe. We have to stop thinking about individualism and actually move to a place where we recognize how interdependent we are. So I'm excited to dig into that. And we have a good guest later who we're going to talk to that about. But before we bring him on, let's go to a break again.
What's up, y'all? Look, Fanbase is more than a platform. It's a movement to empower creators, offering a unique opportunity for everyday people to invest in Black-owned tech, infrastructure, and help shape the future of social media. Investing in technology is essential for creating long-term wealth and influence in the digital age. The Black community must not only consume tech, we must own it.
Discover how equity crowdfunding can serve as a powerful tool for funding Black businesses, allowing entrepreneurs to raise capital directly through their community through the Jobs Act.
We are back with The Other Side of Change, only on the Black Star Network.
So before we went on break, we were talking about the climate implications that are happening all across the country. And to help us understand this moment from a bird's eye view, we have our friend and colleague, Dorien Paul Blythers, to help us really discuss and get into the nitty gritty of this. Dorien, is not only a handsome man, but he also is very qualified to talk about this issue. He is the former Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations at the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, and entered this role with a decade of experience of electoral and issue-based campaign politics. Dorien previously served as the Public Engagement Program Officer for a Climate Action Campaign, and he is now the CEO and founder of Good Rebel. Welcome to The Other Side of Change, Dorien.
Thank you for having me. It's good to see you, Jamira and Brea. Thanks for inviting me into this conversation.
Yes, I'm so excited. And I feel like we got a good freckled light-skinned sandwich for you, Jamira, too.
I know. I'm really happy to be in. We appreciate it. Dorien, I was chatting with you during the height of the LA fires. And I say height, it's still going on, unfortunately. But I remember you showing me like the outside of your balcony. Can you tell us a little bit more about like your experience of what is happening, one in LA, but also what is happening regarding climate change in general across the United States, but also the world, right? We just saw the US pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement. So what are those implications that you're seeing?
Absolutely. It's fascinating that this all just happened 2 weeks ago. I remember the night of the the night that we had that conversation, I was on my balcony, and at this point, the Palisades fire had already been burning. The Eaton fire, where the community of Altadena is, was also burning. But we saw with those extreme wind events, those Santa Ana winds that come in off the mountains, there were literally little fires everywhere all across Los Angeles County. I live in Thai-Town, which is just on the edge of Hollywood, and a very popular hiking destination that some of your favorite influencers hike all the time caught on fire. And that is right here in the heart of Hollywood. We had a fire situation where nearly 100 acres were burning. But for the first time, I had to consider what it would be like to actually leave my house, to have a go bag packed and ready to go. I could see a small orange glow that began to increase in just a matter of minutes. And funny enough, I was actually hosting friends from other parts of the county that were escaping fire to only have to, evacuate here from Hollywood, and find another place to go for the night. But what I realize is that, like, we are in the climate collapse. So for climate activists and organizers like myself who have been talking about these issues as something that is looming or something that is coming, it is absolutely here, and it's been here, and we're going to see that happen. As you stated earlier, in communities across the country, these extreme weather events are becoming more disastrous. And it's so important to contextualize that it is Black and brown communities that are often hit first and worst. And I'm not just talking about, physical property in space. I'm talking about the impact of the fallout of these disasters. There's certainly loss of life that we're seeing. The highest number of casualties came from Altadena, right? Another historically Black community. But also when we think about, what happens after the fires, there are so many people, thousands of people who are out of work in both the Palisades community and Altadena, right? There are thousands of people who are now displaced and considering what they can do with the $43,000 that they're eligible to receive if they qualify for it when applying through FEMA. That doesn't go very far in California when you've lost your vehicle, you've lost your home, maybe you've lost your job, right? We're still learning about the stories that are happening. And it's important for us to, talk about this in a global context. I'm happy that you raised that, because when we think about who climate refugees are, who folks are who are often on the front lines of just the pollution that causes these disasters, but also the fallout from the extreme weather that climate change exacerbates, it's people that look like us. It's Black people first, right? It's brown people. We look at island communities who are experiencing, hurricanes that are larger than they've ever been. This is something that we're experiencing as a global society. And it's important that we get this right now as we kind of shift from, the long held conversations on mitigation to adaptation. How do we live while these things are going on? And how do we rebuild and have resilient communities that allow us to still live with dignity in these really scary times?
Yeah, I'm so glad that you said that, because especially that global context. People don't think, when they think of the terms climate refugees, that sounds like something in the third world, which I don't even use language like that. But like, that's
we are the third
world, right? We in a Gucci belt. That's not,
that was me 2 weeks ago, right? Like,
we never think it'll be us until it's us, and then you're the one thinking, what do I put in the book bag and what's worth taking? And seeing people like making split-second decisions of, this is the only photo I have of my mother, or this is, my child's memories, or whatever. Like, I can't imagine. I mean, it made me and my wife get really serious about, we have to get our to-go bags ready, because we certainly don't have infrastructure down here if something really hit. And people always think, well, I don't live in a community like that. And that's what a lot of people think until it hits your community. So it's definitely so scary. I mean, when you think of this rebuild, what is just and fair when it comes to rebuilding Altadena with Black and brown residents at the center? What needs to be considered that maybe people are not talking about or are only talking about in little whispers, but not on a mainstream scale?
Yeah, I think, I don't know if you all saw that viral Instagram video that went out. There was a young woman named Shelly Bruce, who happens to be a friend of mine, who grew up here in Los Angeles. And she's making, kind of this desperate plea and appeal to all of her followers and everyone who's paying attention around the world on Los Angeles, that like, especially Black folks who she's speaking to, she's like, we are going to make these communities whole again. The Altadena wildfires didn't just destroy homes. It put an entire Black community at risk of permanent displacement. And this is a community that was built on the backs of folks who, were seeking home ownership and economic prosperity because of redlining, right? They were pushed to Altadena and made it a safe haven of activists and artists and professionals who had worked very hard to build this community from the ground up. So when I think about making this community whole, I think first, in any context, it's important for us to allow those communities to first speak for themselves. I was so happy to see, Shelly talk about her family. I was so excited to see viral, influencers and artists from Altadena, people like the celebrity vocal coach Stevie Mackey, right, who's from Altadena, talk about what his family was going through in that over these past few weeks. But first, I think we're going to have to pause and acknowledge that Altadena will never be the same. Altadena, as it was, will never be like that again. And it's going to be on us to, to steal from a former boss and president to build back better. We're going to have to do that and be mindful of how we first stop, the stem of, we need to stem the predatory practices that are actively kind of lurking and waiting to pounce on the economic opportunity that is an entire Black city that's been erased. The governor has, instituted now a 3-month ban or moratorium on developers being able to offer below market value for these properties. We need to question, is 3 months long enough? People are still trying to find clothes to put on their back, right? People are still looking to, get back in their doctor's office and to get their kids back into school. To think that they are having to also contend with, the vultures, right, which is capitalism, coming to profit off of their pain, is the first thing. And there are a number of different things that I think we can do. You all talked about Katrina earlier this episode. We know that there are a lot of mishaps for how, the lower Ninth Ward, was rebuilt. But we need to be asking questions about, like, what does a buyback program look like, right? If the state of California or if LA County is able to purchase these properties at market rate, and then to hold these properties for these families to be able to come back when they have the resources, right? Those are the type of questions and conversations we need to be having, so that we can retain, that safe haven that they've created over, nearly a century.
Yeah, and I think the thing that's being lost in this shuffle right now is this idea that, in addition to the fires, there's the economic implications of the moment, right? We know that last year there was an 18% increase in homelessness across the country. We know that unemployment is on the rise. We know that many tech companies have been laying people off all across California. And for this to happen in the midst of that, as well as we see so much is happening with the tariffs and how that's going to impact more jobs, right? So the fires is one thing, but people's livelihoods across so many different issues are being, like, the pressure is being put on them, and they're not in a place, to your point, to make decisions about the long-term implications of their property, while in the midst of trying to find clothes and food to support their families. It has to be devastating. From what you've seen, I mean, we've talked about this earlier in the show as well, like the community response, like communities are almost showing up much quicker than government agencies and institutions that are supposed to be prepared for devastating moments like this. How do we sustain that kind of momentum long term, knowing that there's probably going to be more devastation that will continue to happen because we're not making the right decisions regarding climate change, especially during an administration that seems almost hostile to even talking about climate change because maybe he thinks it's a part of the DEI strategy? I don't know.
That's right. I think that, while this has been just a tragic couple of weeks for LA and for the country, I've also, as someone who has been in LA for 2 years now, seen the best of who we are. And it's actually young Black millennials that I've seen step up and lead on the recovery and restoration efforts. That has been so inspiring. So, I mentioned Shelley Bruce. She has an organization called the Heart Department. And this organization is literally taking up space in and around in the surrounding communities in Pasadena and Altadena, so that folks can come in and get things like counseling services, so that they can practice in, breath work and movement, right? They're looking at the whole person that's been impacted by this. And then I think of folks like Etienne Maurice with his organization, Walk Good LA, right? Which also has been providing direct services, but taking that a step further and saying, like, we need to make sure that people are whole mentally, socially, and emotionally in this time, because restoration is not going to happen overnight. And us coming together and taking care of one another, the collective, I think in the immediate term is one of the most important things that we can do. And there's been an outpouring of people who have been volunteering and showing up. But in a disaster, in any disaster, there are a few things that we know that we can do. The first thing is to show up, right? So that's volunteering with organizations like the NAACP, right, who are providing advocacy avenues for folks to show up and speak to our representatives here locally and at the federal level. They're also working with attorneys in the legal community and making sure that these families and communities have representation. So showing up, right, is one thing that we can do, using our own labor, our bodies to respond to this. The other thing that we can do is fund it. For those of us that do have resources to donate or to contribute to these organizations, be it dollars or other in-kind resources and services that we can offer, Black and brown organizations that have historically been underfunded are going to be under even greater strain during this disaster. The next thing that I would say we can do is what we're doing right now, which is speaking up and utilizing our platforms to talk about these issues and to educate the public. When the president of the United States spends hours on the other side of town talking to residents in the Palisades, but doesn't mention by name the city of Altadena, which is in LA County, we know that it's incumbent upon us to take our own platforms and to utilize them to do the work. And I know that folks are tired coming out of November, and these last couple of months have felt like a year in and of itself. But for everyone waiting for the cavalry to come in, for the Democrats to come in, for Kamala Harris or Barack Obama or whoever to come in and save the day, my message to folks is that we are the cavalry, and it starts with us. The other piece that I think is important for us to do, so it's showing up, right? It's funding it, it's speaking out, and it's also fighting back. There's a lot of misinformation and disinformation percolating online, in mainstream media, coming out of the White House. We've got to call that out. And we also have to roll up our sleeves and decide what part of this elephant we're going to focus on and just be diligent about accountability, about calling out bad actors, and about asking for more, right? So whether that's the governor and extending this moratorium on, the offers that can be delivered to these communities for buying their homes, whether it is Congress, who hasn't done anything yet. I don't know if folks realize this, but there has been no federal aid bill delivered for the state of California yet. Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, said that he thinks that there should be conditions placed on the aid. That to me is indicative of where we are, and it starts with us. So speak out, fund it, show up, and fight back. That's where we're at.
Yeah. Oh, we are the cavalry. I want that tattooed on my forehead. That's so real. It's so
yes.
What are y'all waiting for?
Right there,
What are you
right?
waiting for?
No,
we're not coming.
And I think it reminds me too to go back to Octavia Butler, but there is a bookstore, Octavia's Bookshelf, in Altadena, very close to Octavia's adult home. And the founder of Octavia's Bookshelf, Nikki High, has also opened up the bookstore to be a refuge. They've been doing mutual aid. They've been housing people. They've been collecting donations and disseminating. And it just reminds me that we can always come together and do the thing that needs to get done faster than the government with red tape. And we have to be the ones doing the thing that needs to get done. So I just really love that you said that. But then you brought up something that's making me a bit nervous, which is we have to be wary of the misinformation, the disinformation, which feels like it's going to be even harder to do when all of the tech CEOs are fleeing from the responsibility to field and moderate that on their platforms. I mean, Zuckerberg, obviously Elon Musk. So it's like, do we stay on these platforms and continue to sound the alarms? Do we need to be doing this outside of the context of these digital spaces? Like, where does digital strategy and digital spreading of information fall into where you see as this need to be speaking truth to power?
That's right. Well, I love, a good newsletter. And there was a point in time when I was on my church's listserv, and they would send out information about any sort of boil water advisory, any public health crisis that was happening in the community, any opportunities, right, for folks to get assistance or resources. I think that we're coming to a point now where we're going to have to give up some of these, the tactics that have helped us spread our messages through big tech, through Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, et cetera, and get back to, direct primary source avenues of sharing information. So whether that's email newsletters again, whether that's public meetings and showing up in person, I think that we're going to have to, think about the most basic organizing principles that gave us the freedoms that we have in this country now, in resorting to those efforts where, the algorithm can't impact, what's being said, where we can't be suppressed. And I think that it's a both and approach. I know that, when I think of my aunts and uncles that are on Facebook, I don't think they're going, anywhere anytime soon. But if they heard from me directly, right, as someone who's on the ground, as someone who's seen the fires, as someone who has worked for the federal agencies that are providing some of the aid and response, right, that carries a lot more weight and value than information that folks can't even trust, right, as being credible or viable anymore. I think we've got to return back to those principles.
Yeah, it has to happen on and offline. It's the reminder that for many of us, millennials who are online, chronically online, like I am, we are oftentimes the biggest source of information to our relatives. So anytime we see information, we consume information, we should be asking questions like, why, how, when, is this true? Should I check another source? Because if we're sharing bad information, especially if we have large platforms, we can do more damage than good. And so it's constantly questioning the information we're consuming with the recognition that it's going to be exhausting, right? One of the reasons why our opposition wins so often is that they want to bombard us with so much tragedy and information at the same time, to the point where we don't know how to respond. But you mentioned earlier, Dorien, the idea idea that, any way to tackle an elephant, we have to each choose a side and eat it bit by bit. We can't do it all. There isn't the expectation that we can do it all. But in this work, we can definitely, working in collaboration with folks, we can definitely hit our target. So thank you so much, Dorien, for coming on. Tell folks where they can find you and tell us more about Good Rebel as we close out this segment.
Yeah, of course. You can find me at goodrebel.co online. I'm also on Instagram at goodrebel.co and at Dorien Paul. That's Dorien with an E, not an A. But we work with brands, nonprofits, influencers, and individuals to really effectuate the change that they want to see in the world. I started this work as an environmental justice activist on the campus of Howard University, where I was afforded the opportunity to sharpen my toolkit to be ready for a time like this. And, I'm excited that you all have this platform for us to, talk about these issues, for us to really give the resources and point folks in the direction that we see to be, a viable direction for progress. But look forward to staying connected with you all and all the folks listening as well.
Sadly enough, I'm sure there's going to be more climate issues. So we'll definitely have to have you back later on. But it's been a pleasure. I mean, this episode was clearly very heavy because we know the fires are still happening. People are still devastated and our government still lacks the ability to respond accordingly. But thank you for being on and shining light on this devastating issue, not just what's happening in LA, but also what's happening around the country and why we should take climate change a little bit more seriously because it can and will impact all of us. So pick up Octavia Butler's book, Parable of the Sower, for those who have not read it yet. It will be very enlightening about the current moment that we're in.
Yeah. And don't forget to support movements like Hands Off Altadena, mutual aid networks, GoFundMes, and anything grassroots, because again, we keep us safe.
Yeah. So until next time, thank you for tuning in for On the Other Side of Change, only on the Black Star Network. You can find both Brea Baker and her on Freckled While Black on Instagram, Threads, and TikTok. And you can find me on all social media platforms at Jamira Burley. It's been a pleasure and have a good day.